In Chaucer's earlier work, such as the translation of the Romaunt of the Rose, if that be his, the Book of the Duchess, the Parliament of Fowls, the House of Fame, as well as in the Legend of Good Women, which was later, the inspiration of the French court poetry of the 13th and 14th centuries is manifest. He retains in them the medieval machinery of allegories and dreams, the elaborate descriptions of palaces, temples, portraitures, etc., which had been made fashionable in France by such poems as Guillaume de Loris's Romance de la Rose and Jean Machot's La Fontaine Amoureuse. In some of these, the influence of Italian poetry is also perceptible. There are suggestions from Dante, for example, in the Parliament of Fowls and the House of Fame, and Troilus and Cressida is a free handling rather than a translation of Boccaccio's Filostrato. In all of these, there are passages of great beauty and force. Had Chaucer written nothing else, he would still have been remembered as the most accomplished English poet of his time, but he would not have risen to the rank which he now occupies, as one of the greatest English poets of all time. This position he owes to his masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales. Here he abandoned the imitation of foreign models and the artificial literary fashions of his age, and wrote of real life from his own ripe knowledge of men and things. The Canterbury Tales are a collection of stories written at different times, but put together probably toward the close of his life. The framework into which they are fitted is one of the happiest ever devised. A number of pilgrims who were going on horseback to the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket at Canterbury meet at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, a suburb of London. The jolly host of the Tabard, Harry Bailey, proposes that on their way to Canterbury, each of the company shall tell 2 tales, and 2 more on their way back, and that the one who tells the best shall have a supper at the cost of the rest when they return to the inn. He himself accompanies them as judge and reporter. In the setting of the stories there is thus a constant feeling of movement and the air of all outdoors. The little head-links and end-links which bind them together give incidents of the journey and glimpses of the talk of the pilgrims, sometimes amounting, as in the prologue of the Wife of Bath, to full and almost dramatic character sketches. The stories, too, are dramatically suited to the narrators. The general prologue is a series of such character sketches, the most perfect in English poetry. The portraits of the pilgrims are illuminated with the soft brilliancy and the minute loving fidelity of the miniatures in the old missals, and with the same quaint precision in traits of expression and in costume. The pilgrims are not all such as one would meet nowadays at an English inn. The presence of a knight, a squire, a yeoman archer, and especially of so many kinds of ecclesiastics, a nun, a friar, a monk, a pardoner, and a sompnour or apparitor, reminds us that the England of that day must have been less like Protestant England as we know it, than like the Italy of some 30 years ago. But however the outward face of society may have changed, the Canterbury Pilgrims remain, in Chaucer's description, living and universal types of human nature. The Canterbury Tales are 24 in number. There were 32 pilgrims, so that if finished as designed, the whole collection would have numbered 128 stories. Chaucer is the bright, consummate flower of the English Middle Age. Like many another great poet, he put the final touch to the various literary forms that he found in cultivation. Thus, his Knight's Tale, based on Boccaccio's Teseide, is the best of English medieval romances. And yet the Rime of Sir Thopas, who goes seeking an elf queen for his mate, and is encountered by the giant Sir Oliphant, burlesques these same romances with their impossible adventures and their tedious rambling descriptions. The tales of the prioress and the second nun are saints' legends. The monk's tale is a set of dry moral apologues in the manner of his contemporary, the moral Gower. The stories told by the reeve, miller, friar, sompnour, shipman, and merchant belong to the class of fabliaux, a few of which existed in English, such as Dame Cerise, The Lay of the Ash, and The Land of Cockaigne, already mentioned. The nun-priest's tale, likewise, which Dryden modernized with admirable humour, was of the class of fabliaux, and was suggested by a little poem in 40 lines, Du Coq et Verpil, by Marie de France, a Norman poetess of the 13th century. It belonged, like the early English poem of The Fox and the Wolf, to the popular animal saga of Reynard the Fox. The Franklin's Tale, whose scene is Brittany, and the Wife of Bath's tale, which is laid in the time of the British Arthur, belonged to the class of French lais. serious metrical tales shorter than the romance, and of Breton origin, the best representatives of which are the elegant and graceful lays of Marie de France. Chaucer was our first great master of laughter and of tears. His serious poetry is full of the tenderest pathos. His loosest tales are delightfully humorous and lifelike. He is the kindliest of satirists. The knavery, greed, and hypocrisy of the begging friars and the sellers of indulgences are exposed by him as pitilessly as by Langland and Wycliffe, though his mood is not like theirs, one of stern moral indignation, but rather the good-natured scorn of a man of the world. His charity is broad enough to cover even the corrupt Sompnour, of whom he says, "And yet, in sooth, he was a good fellow." Whether he shared Wycliffe's opinions is unknown, but John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster and father of Henry IV., who was Chaucer's lifelong patron, was likewise Wycliffe's great upholder against the persecution of the bishops. It is, perhaps, not without significance that the poor parson in the Canterbury Tales, the only one of his ecclesiastical pilgrims whom Chaucer treats with respect, is suspected by the host of the Tabard to be a Lollard, that is, a Lollard, or disciple of Wycliffe, and that because he objects to the jovial innkeeper's swearing by God's bones. Chaucer's English is nearly as easy for a modern reader as Shakespeare's, and few of his words have become obsolete. His verse, when rightly read, is correct and melodious. The early English was, in some respects, more sweet upon the tongue than the modern language. The vowels had their broad Italian sounds, and the speech was full of soft gutturals and vocalic syllables, like the endings in, is, and e, which made feminine rhymes and kept the consonants from coming harshly together. Great poet as Chaucer was, he was not quite free from the literary weakness of his time. He relapses sometimes into the babbling style of the old chroniclers and legend writers, cites auteurs, and gives long catalogues of names and objects with a naive display of learning, and introduces vulgar details in his most exquisite passages. There is something childish about almost all the thought and art of the Middle Ages, at least outside of Italy, where classical models and traditions never quite lost their hold. But Chaucer's artlessness is half the secret of his wonderful ease in story-telling, and is so engaging that, like a child's sweet unconsciousness, one would not wish it otherwise. The Canterbury Tales had shown of what high uses the English language was capable, but the curiously trilingual condition of literature still continued. French was spoken in the proceedings of Parliament as late as the reign of Henry VI, 1422 to 1471. Chaucer's contemporary, John Gower, wrote his Vox Clamantis in Latin, his Speculum Meditantis, a lost poem, and a number of ballades, in Parisian French, and his Confessio Amantis, 1393, in English. The last named is a dreary, pedantic work, in some 15,000 smooth, monotonous, 8-syllabled couplets, in which Grand Amour instructs the lover how to get the love of Belle Pucelle.